Hello, bonjour, salve, sono Brian Mossop e mi fa molto piacere stare insieme a voi, anche se solo per qualche minuto, e presentarvi il mio lavoro, ma non in italiano. Way back in 1974, I started work as a French to English translator at the Canadian government's Translation Bureau 5 years after our Parliament passed the Official Languages Act, making English and French the official languages of Canada. A few years later, after I became a reviser of other people's translations, I was asked to teach revision to translation students at York University here in Toronto. At translation schools in Canada, revision has been a separate compulsory course since the mid-1970s. The main point of such courses is to learn how to check your own translations. It's not easy to spot mistakes, and there are many other difficulties, such as a temptation to make many unnecessary changes. In 1990, I conducted a survey of revision courses at Canadian translation schools, and I reported the results at a conference on translator training in Denmark. There I met Anthony Pym, whose writings in the academic field of translation studies are now very well known. Anthony became the editor of a series of publications called Translation Practices Explained, and in 1999 he asked me to write a book about translation revision. The first edition appeared in 2001, followed by 3 more editions. The latest, 4th edition, was published in early 2020. Back then, at the turn of the century, I wondered if I could think of enough things to say about revision to fill an entire book. I started with ideas I had had to formulate in order to explain revision to students orally in the classroom, as well as ideas I had published in 2 short articles. I started expanding these ideas and I added numerous textual examples from translations I was revising in my work at the Translation Bureau. A big breakthrough came when I started writing about the process of checking the language quality of a translation. For it then occurred to me that I could also write about editing original writing. I took inspiration from the Canadian Editors Association, which was offering learning materials for the professional development of practicing editors. The Editors Association divides editing into copy editing, stylistic editing, structural editing, and content editing. And these are the topics now covered in chapters 3 to 6 of my book. Some translation students, when they graduate, go on to be editors or do both editing and translating. Also, here in Canada, native speakers of English often edit English written by French speakers, a topic which I discuss in chapter 2 of my book. Perhaps the same is true in Italy, with native speakers of English editing English written by Italian speakers. I decided that half of my book would deal with editing original writing, but from the point of view of a translator, whence my title, Revising and Editing for Translators. For the recent 4th edition, I asked a Korean translator, Jung-Min Hong, to write a chapter on a practice known as trans-editing. In trans-editing, a journalist translates news stories, but also makes major changes in the structure and content of the article. So she translates, but at the same time does a lot of structural editing and a lot of content editing. The second half of my book deals with translation revision, especially revision of other people's translations. Chapter 14 is devoted to self-revision, that is, checking your own translations, but much of what I say in the book applies to both self-revision and revision of others. Revision is a topic that used to be of interest only within organizations of professional translators and within big translation services such as those of the Canadian government, the United Nations, and the European Union. Since the 1980s, I've led many one-day revision workshops for these organizations. At first I did this only in Canada, But then, after my book appeared in 2001, I was invited to lead workshops in other countries. My book turned out to be a ticket to international travel once it became known in translation services, translators organizations, and translators schools and translation schools abroad. In Europe, I've led workshops in Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Portugal, France, and Austria, but so far not in Italy. By contrast with this practical interest in revision, the academic study of revision is very recent. Almost all research publications date from the last 20 years. In the past 10 years, a growing number of graduate students have written master's theses or doctoral dissertations on revision. The academic interest in revision has been triggered by three developments in the translation industry. First, machine translation outputs have only recently become widely usable by professional translators, at least with some language pairs. This has created interest in the process of revising these machine outputs, which is known as post-editing. The latest edition of my book includes a chapter by a Brazilian translation scholar, Carlos Teixeira, about translation memory and machine translation. These technologies suggest wordings in the target language that often have to be revised, either to convey the meaning of the source text or to improve the language quality. A second cause of interest in revision is that translators are now easily available to clients over the internet. Since the turn of the century, companies that want translations no longer have to make a telephone call to translation agencies in their own city. They can simply post their job request at a translation website. As a result, there has been huge pressure for translators to drop prices and produce work more quickly. Inevitably, this has led to greatly increased concern about quality. And achieving adequate quality is, of course, the whole point of revision. There are now many academic studies looking at the effects of revision on quality. The third cause of interest in revision is that a European standard for translation services was published in 2006, and then an international standard 5 years ago in 2015. If a translation service is certified under these standards, then it must have every translation it produces revised by a second translator. This too has made revision a topic of interest to university-based researchers. I myself retired from my job as a translator and reviser 6 years ago, though I continue to teach and write about revision. There's always a need for new young translators to take the place of us retirees. I hope some of you are considering translation as an occupation. If so, now would be a good time to start learning how to check translations for quality. Goodbye. Au revoir. Arrivederci.